Will you join me in saying our chalice lighting words?
We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
So, last year, Emily and I had a chance to spend a little time in the Netherlands a few days. This is a trip that I had been looking forward to my entire life because this was the main, my heritage, my ancestry that I can trace back. My great-great-grandfather, actually, the first person to come here from Holland was the person I was named after, Marcus Kersinga. He, it sounds like, was a little bit of a rascal. When he came to the States, instead of going straight to Michigan where the family was settling, he wasted the family fortune on gambling and girls in New York City. And then had to ride under women's petticoats to be on the train to get to Michigan, so he didn't have to pay for a ticket. I don't know why my mom named me after him. Uh-oh, this thing. Thanks. So anyhow, that's another story. I really want to tell you about the thing that my mom held on to. Here we are a few generations later. Mom has held on to this one last love from her Dutch ancestry, tulips. And tulips are not actually from the Netherlands. They're of Turkish ancestry. They were brought there by Dutch colonists, orientalists. That's another story as well. So what I really want to tell you about is my mom's love of tulips. And each year in California, you can't grow tulips in quite the same way. It's a little more, you have to put them in the refrigerator, the bulbs, for several months to get them cold enough, and then plant them at just the right moment. And then I remember every year waiting in anticipation with the bulbs come up this year. But we have our tulips that my mom longed for every year. And so when we were in the Netherlands, we visited the Keukenhof, the National Dutch Tulip Gardens. This really incredible, just acre and acre and acre of tulip gardens. Outdoors and indoors, tulips of every color and every shape. And really it's a tourist place. You have to get there by going on big tourist buses, and then you stand in long lines to get in, and then you wander through, and there's cafeteria in between each tulip field, and there's a souvenir shop in between each. It's kind of like Tulip Disneyland, really. But after being there and seeing all those beautiful tulips, and after seeing the beautiful tulips here last spring, I decided this was finally time for me to take up this piece of my ancestry. So last week, a week and a half ago, when we had that incredible weather for a few days, I got my tulip bulbs, and I got my trowel, and I got my kneeling pad. I really need the kneeling pad. And I started to dig very dutifully my 8-inch deep holes, 4 to 6 inches apart, all in a nice neat line. And by the 4th or 5th one, boy, I was done. My knees, my back, my hands are getting kind of calloused. And so I was complaining about it to my father-in-law, Emily's dad, on the phone later, and he said, well, you don't have to get down on your knees each time. I dig one big hole, and then dump all the bulbs in, and that's just as easy. And my mother-in-law, I can hear her rolling her eyes over the phone. And she says, well, yes, Chuck, and that's why our tulips always land in one big clump. Planting tulips is hard work, and yet that is why we come to church, to be reminded that connection to ourselves, to each other, to what matters most, to our ancestry, is worth the hard work. Welcome again to our celebration of life. Will you rise and body your spirit, and we'll sing our first hymn. It's 357, Bright Morning Stars, in that gray hymn. And will you join me now in a time of meditation and prayer, followed by a moment of shared silence. Allow your feet to find the ground, connecting you to this good earth. Feel your breath moving in and out. And turn inward with me now. These words from Warsan Sire, a Somali British writer. Later that night, I held an atlas in my lap, ran my fingers across the whole world and whispered, "Where does it hurt?" It answered, "Everywhere. Everywhere. Everywhere. There is hurt and pain in Paris this evening. There is hurt and pain in Beirut this evening. There is hurt and pain in Syria this evening. There is hurt and pain in Iraq this evening. There is hurt and pain at our own borders this evening. Where does it hurt? Everywhere. Everywhere. Everywhere." And with all this hurt, we hold in prayer, in love, in care, the many lives ended by terror and violence in that city of love last night, Friday night. We hold in love the thousands and thousands of lives devastated by war. We hold in love with that day celebrating our veterans this last week, all those who bear the cost of conflict long after the last shot is fired. And we hold also in love the world leaders, the policymakers, all those facing decisions with responsibility to protect and care for their peoples and for the future. And we hold in love the parents, the grandparents, the families, the siblings who fear for their loved ones' safety and survival, who grieve the passing of dear ones. Everywhere, 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 we hold in love. Everyone, we hold in love. With all that is, all that cries out, may the silence that we have shared continue to hold and heal us all. May be so, and amen. I titled this sermon, "Old Furniture, Family Stories, and Other Bones We Carry." And I have to swear to you that I was not thinking about all of the old furniture that would be surrounding us today. But it's perfect. Have any of you ever inherited furniture? Well, I thought that might be the case. Yeah, me too. When we first came to Rochester, actually, we both Emily and I had desks from our grandfathers, and we brought them into our office. I had lugged my grandfather's desk all the way out from California. Hers happened to be sitting here in Rochester, actually, just up in Victor. And we got our desks into the office up there at First Unitarian Rochester, and we were kind of figuring out, had a little bit of a jigsaw. Hers was enormous, mine was a little small. And we were trying to figure out how we could figure out how to fit them both in, and we were just both sitting there at our grandfather's desks, and I discovered that mine was not going to work for me. It was a little bit too small, and my knees kept bumping against the bottom of it. That week, Emily's mom brought an entire truck full of inherited furniture out from Minnesota, and some of it is sitting in the basement, and some of it is adorning the house in beautiful ways. I mentioned all of this furniture struggles with the other ministers at the time, and immediately out started pouring stories, all of the things they had inherited. And one story particularly grabbed everyone's attention. That was the story of grandmother's ugly China. The China that she was so beloved, and yet the minister who was sharing this with me could not see anything to do with. What do you do with Grandma's ugly China? A teacher from seminary, the president of my seminary actually, Rebecca Parker, tells a story. She started it by saying, "Captain of my ship and master of my soul, I had valiantly chartered my course to become first a cellist, then a minister, and now an educator." This was her at her arrival as president of the seminary. This incredible captain of her ship. Anyone ever feel like, yes, I've done it. I've captained my ship and I'm in the place I meant to be. And so upon arrival at that seminary, she got in touch with some distant relatives who were in the area. And she was going to show up for a little family reunion with them, some cousins who she had never met before. And her first impression as she was going to meet these cousins was from the bumper stickers on the cars outside the house. The first bumper sticker: "If you want peace, work for justice." Another: "Teachers, do it with class." Another: "Live music is best." And then there was one that said, "If you love Jesus, tithe." And when she met them, she discovered one was a minister of religious education, another a French horn player and high school music teacher, another a seminary dean, another a parish minister. Every single one of these distant cousins was a minister, a teacher, or a musician. And several were all three, just like her. And not only that, the ministers, she said, were all liberal social activists with an intellectual bent, and the musicians were all classical. After the shock of discovering that perhaps she had not made her own choices in quite the way she had imagined, she concluded the story with this point: "I did not make myself. My life was given to me. And this is how it is. We receive who we are before we choose who we will become." We receive who we are before we choose who we will become. Thinking about that story, I was struck by Bill Bryson's words in our Soul Matters packet this month. His words go like this: "To be here now, alive in the 21st century and smart enough to know it, you had to be extremely, and make that miraculously fortunate in your personal ancestry. Consider the fact that for 3.8 billion years, a period of time older than Earth's mountains and rivers and oceans, every one of your forebears on both sides has been attractive enough to find a mate, healthy enough to reproduce, and sufficiently blessed by fate and circumstances to do so. Not one of your pertinent ancestors was squashed, devoured, drowned, starved, stranded, stuck fast, wounded, or otherwise deflected from its life's quest of delivering a tiny charge of genetic material to the right partner at the right moment in order to perpetuate the only possible sequence of hereditary combinations that could result eventually, astoundingly, and all too briefly, in you. Each of us are shaped by biology and so much more, shaped and formed over generations to become the unique individuals that we are. We're shaped with unique gifts and callings, prepared by all that has come before to lead the only life that we can live. And maybe all of this has so much resonance for me because, you may know this, one of my moms is a minister, and also my grandfather was a minister. And I want to share with you a little about my grandfather's story today. For now, you just need to know he was a Presbyterian minister, and he was a professor of homiletics, of preaching, for a lot of his career. I never got to meet him, but one of his students described him to me once as towering like a giant in the pulpit, and that he would make Bible stories come alive. And so as we talk about ancestry this month, I think it might be important to mention the Bible, that bound and printed piece of our religious ancestry that we are so ambivalent about. But those early stories of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the Torah, were in large part the story of ancestry, right? They were the stories of who begat whom, of where a people came from. They were stories meant to give people a lineage. You come from this line. These are the stories of your people. And I think that, at least in part, the writers of these stories knew that that's what they were doing. Do you know the story of Joseph? Joseph, the Technicolor Dreamcoat guy, he was the youngest brother in a big family. And to make a long story, a very long story, very, very short, his siblings sold him into slavery in Egypt, where he climbed the ladder and became a very important vizier. And eventually reconciled with his family and supported them through hard times when they came and lived with him in Egypt. And finally, he prepared to die at the ripe old age of 110. But before he died, he made the children of Israel promise that when they left the land of Egypt, they would take his bones with them. Kind of an odd promise to ask. But so jumping forward several generations, there was Moses, right, confronting the Pharaoh for the umpteenth time, preparing the Israelites to flee Egypt. It was all a rush, no time to let the bread rise. Take only what you can carry on your back. Leave before Pharaoh has a chance to change his mind once again. And in all this haste, this ancient oath to Joseph was so important that Moses himself took the time to collect Joseph's bones so the people could carry them back to Israel. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, Exodus says, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. What bones do you carry? What is so important that you've hauled it land to land? I carry my grandfather's bones, though I never met him. I never met him because he was actually murdered before I was born. He was murdered by a man who picked him up in a gay bar. My grandfather, you see, was gay, and he was closeted his entire life. As a Presbyterian minister of those times, these were two lives that could not be brought back together. And because of that silence and secrecy, because of the culture of the times, it was dangerous to be a gay man in a gay bar, dangerous enough that a young man who was incredibly conflicted, I think, about his own sexuality, picked my grandfather up and then ended up murdering him that night. This, of course, rippled throughout the family. Each of my mom's siblings, 4 sisters, all took this trauma in a different way. For my mom, it ended in depression. She lived with a serious chronic depression for much of her adult life. And I, in turn, inherited those bones from her. Right? This is how we do it. We pass on the good and the bad, all of ourselves, generation to generation. And I've had my struggles with depression, with mental health. And I've seen our mental health institutions from a few angles now, serving as a chaplain, providing spiritual care, as a family member, and as a patient myself. When I was 17, I actually spent a week in a juvenile inpatient psych facility struggling with my own overwhelming pain and sorrow. And what saved me was not psychiatrists or the time at the hospital or pharmaceuticals or therapists or exercise, though they were all helpful, especially exercise. But what saved me was a religious community, a religious tradition that told me to seek support anywhere I could find it. To open to Buddhist teachings and practices of mindfulness, as well as to the wisdom in the scientific tradition of psychology and psychiatry. What saved me was a religious community that told me with so much more than words, you are loved. At the root of it all, there is a love holding you, a love holding all. No matter what you do, or what you say, or what you think, or what you feel, you are loved. And these were the bones of Hosea Ballou, the early Universalist circuit rider who proclaimed God's universal love. Our religious tradition has been carrying his bones for over 200 years. But I doubt that you would find any 17-year-old today, or anyone of any age really, who gets the experience of being loved by reading Ballou's A Treatise on Atonement. But my religious community, my Unitarian Universalist congregation, had brought those bones to life, had given them flesh and made them real for me today. So we carry the bones of our ancestors, and together we carry the bones of our spiritual heritage, the bones of this congregation and of Unitarian Universalism. Our congregation is built on a foundation of lives and stories. And in turn, our lives and stories will shape generations to come who will carry our bones and write new chapters beyond any one ministry, beyond any one gathering. And beyond our congregation, our living tradition carries some weighty bones. Some are beautiful bones that we proudly display, those transcendentalist bones of Thoreau and Emerson, Margaret Fuller, those activist bones, Susan B. Anthony, free thinking, a theology centered on connection, a passion for wider and wider inclusion. Good, weighty bones. And we carry other bones too. The bones that perhaps we'd rather stick in the basement with Grandma's ugly china. Theodore Parker's radical stance as an abolitionist got him kicked out of the Unitarian Conference at the time. Our history of intellectual arrogance, believing that we see more clearly, more true than others, the thoroughly botched decision-making and process over funding racial justice work in the late 60s, sometimes referred to as the Black Empowerment Controversy, or perhaps more accurately, as Reverend Mark Morrison Reed would put it, the white controversy over Black empowerment that we are still living with the legacy of today. All these are bones we carry. And so the truth is, if you go into our office today, you won't see my grandfather's desk. It was a tough choice, but after hauling it like Joseph's bones all the way from California and reassembling it in the office, I had to take it apart and take it back out again. And until last week, it sat in the garage like that poor unloved china, precious for its history, but also useless to me, taking up space and unneeded. So this week I set it out on the curb and let it go. My grandfather's story, work lives in my bones. No need to haul around that heavy desk anymore. In 2008, after my moms had been together for 25 years, we gathered in our living room for a simple ceremony where they were finally legally wed. I asked my mom what her dad, what my grandfather would have thought of that moment. And she said he couldn't have imagined a world where this could happen. Couldn't have imagined it. Our children and grandchildren will someday carry our bones. Sometimes they will just shove them in the basement or leave them on the curb with all that ugly china that we're cherishing right now in our glass cupboards. But we'll also use them in the service of love and justice to create a world that we can't even imagine today. And this will only happen if we care for those bones we've been given. Joseph's bones and Joseph's promise would never have made it to Moses if not for years of religious people doing the work of remembering and passing down a legacy from generation to generation. I did not make myself. My life was given to me. And this is how it is. We receive who we are before we choose who we will become. Amen. And blessed be. Reach out a hand. Let us join together and be connected. Be reminded of the truth that we are one body. We depend upon one another more than we know. And will you join me in saying our closing words? We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Amen.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.